All right, strap yourselves in because we are going full 80s today for this deep dive.
I am ready. Let's do it.
Yeah, you guys requested we go back in time and focus on the 80s, specifically pop culture and the rise of video games. And I gotta say, cracking open this book, The Awesome 1980s,
Yeah.
Pop Culture and the Rise of Video Games, is like, whoa.
It really takes you back, doesn't it?
Yeah.
You really feel like you're there.
Totally. The book does a really good job of like setting the scene. It talks about how video games, music, fashion, movies, it was all kind of feeding off of each other.
Yeah.
Creating this, this totally unique moment.
And it's interesting, actually, how the book sort of sets the stage. Because it wasn't all just, neon and leg warmers.
Right?
You had, like, the Cold War was a big thing back then.
Oh, yeah.
Really created this sense of global unease.
Yeah, like what if, right?
Exactly. And then at the same time, you've got like technologies exploding, personal computers are starting to become more widespread.
Yeah.
But nobody really knows what to do with them yet.
Right.
It's just this feeling of like potential.
Like, yeah, it could be way more than just a fancy calculator, but we don't know what yet.
Exactly.
So, okay, you've got this mix of anxiety but possibility swirling around.
Yeah.
Kind of like the perfect recipe for some major cultural shifts, right?
Exactly. And, I think one of those shifts, probably the biggest one, the most unexpected one anyway, was the rise of video games.
Oh, for sure.
And, no conversation about 80s gaming would be complete without talking about Pac-Man.
Come on, right.
And the book, it spends a lot of time on Pac-Man.
Yeah.
And it kind of got me thinking, why did Pac-Man become such a phenomenon?
Yeah, that's a good question.
It wasn't just, the newness of video games. There was something more to it, right?
Yeah. I mean, the game's so simple.
Right.
Like you're just eating dots and avoiding ghosts. But maybe that was part of the appeal, especially in a world that felt kind of, increasingly complex and out of control.
That's a great point. I mean, there's something almost meditative about that gameplay loop.
Yeah.
Just gobbling dots,
Totally.
It's a digital stress reliever.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, if you think about it through the lens of, the Cold War that was going on, that maze almost becomes like a metaphor.
Whoa.
You're navigating this confined space, trying to outmaneuver these threats. It's like a simplified version of, the geopolitical landscape.
Wow, I never thought of it that way. That's really interesting.
Yeah.
It's amazing how a game that seems so simple on the surface can actually reflect deeper anxieties.
And the book also makes the point that part of Pac-Man's success was also its accessibility.
Right.
I mean, it transcended age, gender, cultural background.
Totally.
Everyone could understand it.
Yeah.
Get lost in that, that simple pursuit of points.
Yeah. And it's funny how that idea, right, simple, addictive gameplay, it still works today.
Oh, yeah.
You think about the most popular mobile games now.
Yeah.
A lot of them, they're built on that same principle.
Yeah, totally.
Maybe Pac-Man was just way ahead of its time.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It really foreshadowed the whole power of intuitive game design. A game doesn't have to be complex to be captivating.
True.
Which, actually, speaking of captivating, reminds me of another revolution that was happening in the 80s. This one totally changed how we experience music.
Okay.
MTV. Can you believe there was a time before music videos were everywhere?
I know, right? It's hard to imagine.
Before MTV, music was mainly something you just heard on the radio.
Yeah.
But then MTV comes along. Suddenly, music's something you see.
Yeah.
And it wasn't just about seeing the bands play. It was about the visual stories, the concepts, the whole spectacle.
Right, you had artists like Duran Duran and Prince.
Yeah.
Creating these mini movies basically. And their music became inseparable from those visuals.
It was a total game changer. And it's really interesting how MTV tapped into that 80s trend of blending different mediums. Music videos. They were early examples of multimedia storytelling.
Yeah.
Years before the internet made that kind of thing normal. What are some modern examples of that kind of blending we see today? What do you think?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, think about how we experience music now. We've got virtual concerts, interactive online music experiences. Even social media is a huge part of how music is, discovered and shared these days.
Exactly. Those lines between different forms of media, they're getting blurrier all the time.
Sure.
And you could argue that MTV, with its focus on, visuals and storytelling, really helped pave the way for that.
Totally. It's like MTV was saying, hey, music can be more than just sound. It can be a whole experience.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And while all this was happening, another revolution was kind of brewing. The rise of affordable home computers. You remember those clunky beige boxes?
Oh, yeah.
Apple II, Commodore 64.
Mm-hmm.
They weren't just for work or school anymore.
Right.
The book describes this period as like a DIY revolution.
Yeah.
Because suddenly people had access to this incredible technology at home.
Yeah.
And they weren't just passively consuming content, they were creating it.
Right.
The book talks about these early online communities called bulletin board systems.
BBSs.
BBSs, yeah.
Yeah.
Where people would, share their own software, games, they'd chat with each other. It was like a proto-internet, totally DIY.
Yeah.
Community-driven.
Totally.
It's amazing to think about how, like, those early digital pioneers were laying the foundation for the internet we know today.
Yeah.
That collaborative spirit.
Yeah.
The open sharing of ideas. It all started with a bunch of people tinkering on their computers in their basements and bedrooms.
It's like they planted the seed for a whole new way of connecting and creating.
Yeah, totally. And it's interesting, right? Because while all that was happening with home computers, there was this whole other thing going on with, video games themselves.
Yeah.
Remember we were talking about the video game crash of '83.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, that almost wiped out the entire home console market.
Yeah, it was like a total implosion.
Yeah.
The book really does a good job of explaining, like, how the market just got flooded with all these, like, really bad games.
Right.
Just the quality control was terrible.
Yeah.
People just stopped trusting video games.
Totally.
Like, the whole industry was in free fall.
Yeah, and then, like, out of the ashes of that crash rises Nintendo.
Yeah.
Like, their entry into the U.S. market in '85 with the NES,
Yeah.
it was like a phoenix moment for gaming.
Yeah.
I mean, the book really does call it a revolution, and I think that's a pretty accurate description.
Yeah, I love how the book talks about Nintendo's strategy because they're really smart about, like, quality control.
Yeah.
Like, remember that gold seal?
Yeah.
The seal of quality that was on all the NES cartridges?
Yes.
It was like a guarantee that you were getting a good game.
Right. Like, they understood that people had been burned.
Yeah.
They'd been burned by, all these shoddy Atari games.
Yeah.
So they knew they had to, like, rebuild that trust.
Yeah.
And that seal, it was a symbol of that. It was like a symbol of quality, reliability.
Yeah. And of course they backed it up
Yeah.
with some of the most iconic games ever made.
Totally. I mean, come on. Like, where would we be without Super Mario Bros?
Right. Like, can you imagine
It's crazy.
a world without Mario? It's mind-blowing.
It's wild.
Yeah.
The book actually argues that Super Mario Bros., like, single-handedly resurrected the home console market.
It was that good.
Yeah, it wasn't just good. It was revolutionary.
Yeah.
I mean, the level design, the music, the introduction of all these iconic characters like Mario and Luigi and Princess Peach and Bowser.
Yeah.
Like, it set a whole new standard for what a video game could be.
For sure.
And it did something else that was really important, too.
What's that?
It made gaming family-friendly.
Oh, yeah.
Nintendo, they understood, like, to really succeed, they couldn't just cater to hardcore gamers, right?
Oh, yeah.
They had to appeal to, like, a much broader audience.
Totally.
They needed to bring in the families, the kids, heck, even the grandparents.
Yeah.
And they did that by creating games that were fun, accessible, and colorful.
Yeah.
It was a huge shift from, like, the more niche and edgy games that had dominated the early '80s.
Oh, for sure.
And they were masters of marketing, too.
Yeah.
Remember those classic NES commercials?
Oh, yeah.
Now you're playing with power.
Oh, come on. That was so good.
Yeah, they knew how to get people excited
Yeah.
about their product.
They made that gray and black box with the red buttons like the hottest thing on the market.
Yeah, totally.
Like, it wasn't just a console, it was a status symbol.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
They really tapped into something.
Rrr.
But it wasn't all just Nintendo, though.
Right.
The book also talks about how the rise of video games in the '80s, it kind of started to bleed into other parts of pop culture.
Oh, yeah.
You know?
Like, video games were suddenly everywhere.
Oh, yeah.
You had, like, songs like Pac-Man Fever.
Yeah.
You had T-shirts with, like, pixelated characters on them. It was like video game culture was becoming mainstream culture.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, it was a sign that video games were starting to be taken seriously,
Yeah.
as a form of entertainment, maybe even an art form.
Right.
And, you saw this reflected in movies, too.
Yeah.
Like Tron and War Games,
Yeah.
which dealt with these themes of technology, virtual reality, artificial intelligence.
It's so interesting how those movies, like, captured kind of the anxiety and the hope people had about technology at the time. Like,
Really?
we were excited about the possibilities,
Yeah.
but also a little bit afraid of, the unknown.
Right. Like, what if this stuff gets too powerful?
Yeah.
And that duality,
Yeah.
that sense of, like, excitement and unease, it's like really at the heart of the 80s.
It's true. Yeah.
You've got the Cold War on one hand, this looming threat of like global conflict.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, you've got this explosion of technology and creativity.
Yeah, it's true. It's like video games, maybe they provided like an outlet,
Right.
a way to kind of explore those anxieties and desires, in a safe, controlled environment.
Yeah, yeah.
You could be a hero, conquer challenges, escape into these fantastical worlds.
And that's something that, obviously still resonates with us today.
Oh, yeah.
Right, that desire to like escape,
Oh.
to connect with others, to challenge ourselves. Like, it's part of what makes video games so enduring.
It's true.
It really is.
Yeah.
But, even though Nintendo was really dominating the console market at this point,
Yeah.
Their reign wasn't going to last forever. And the book kind of hints at this.
Yeah.
Towards the end of the decade, there's a new challenger emerging.
Oh, who's that?
A certain blue blur was about to speed onto the scene
Oh.
and shake things up.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
Sega was waiting in the wings, and they were ready to challenge Nintendo's supremacy.
Okay.
The bold new strategy.
All right, well, you're going to have to tell us more about that.
Oh, yeah, but that, my friend, is a story for the next part of our deep dive.
All right, so we've covered a lot of ground here.
We have.
Pac-Man, MTV, Nintendo, like it's been a wild ride.
Yeah.
But as the 80s were coming to an end, you said there was a new challenger approaching.
Oh, yeah. A new player was about to enter the game.
Okay.
Sega was ready to make their move, and they had a very different strategy in mind.
Okay, tell me more about this.
So instead of trying to, compete with Nintendo's family-friendly image,
Yeah.
they decided to go in a totally different direction.
Okay.
The book calls it the genesis of cool,
I like that.
which I think is a pretty perfect description.
Yeah, yeah.
Because they were trying to appeal to like a slightly older audience,
Okay.
teenagers mostly, kids who were looking for something a little bit edgier, a little bit more mature.
Right.
And the Sega Genesis, which they launched in 1989, it was a really powerful machine.
Yeah.
It had better graphics, and their games often pushed the boundaries of what was considered acceptable at the time.
Oh, interesting.
Like, they weren't afraid to be a little bit controversial.
Oh, okay.
And of course, their mascot, like the face of Sega,
Yeah.
was the complete opposite of the lovable Mario.
Who is that?
It was Sonic the Hedgehog.
Ah, yes.
That blue blur.
So cool.
Yeah, all attitude and speed.
Oh, I remember like when I was a kid thinking Sonic was so cool.
Oh, yeah.
He was like the rebel
Totally.
of the video game world.
He's like the perfect embodiment of Sega's whole brand.
Yeah, yeah.
Their marketing was all about attitude, rebellion, pushing the limits.
I love it.
I mean, they even had that slogan.
Oh, yeah.
Genesis does what Nintendo.
That's so good. Yeah.
They weren't shy about like taking jabs at the competition.
Yeah, they wanted to position themselves as like the cooler alternative, the more mature option. Yeah.
The grown-up console.
And it worked.
It did.
Because like all of a sudden you had this huge rivalry between Sega and Nintendo.
Oh, yeah.
Like it was like the video game version of Coke versus Pepsi.
Right.
Every kid had to choose a side.
It's like a cultural phenomenon.
Yeah.
And, it wasn't just about like marketing or brand loyalty.
Right.
This rivalry, it actually drove a lot of innovation.
Oh, interesting. How so?
Well, because both companies, they were constantly trying to outdo each other,
Yeah.
pushing the limits of graphics, gameplay, technology. I mean, that era gave us so many iconic franchises,
Oh, yeah. Like what?
like Sonic the Hedgehog, obviously, but also Street Fighter II, Mortal Kombat.
Yeah.
Like some of the biggest games of all time came out of that period of intense competition.
Yeah, it's crazy to think how different the 90s would have been without those games.
Oh, yeah.
That was such a golden age.
It really was. And it was all fueled in part by that rivalry.
Yeah, I mean, it was like this perfect storm.
It really was. But while all that was going on with the consoles,
Yeah.
there was something else brewing. Something that would eventually change the entire landscape of gaming.
What's that?
It was the rise of the personal computer
As a gaming platform.
as a serious gaming platform.
Okay.
Yeah, so while Sega and Nintendo were duking it out in the living room,
Yeah.
PC gaming was quietly gaining steam.
Interesting.
Like games like Doom, Wolfenstein 3D, Civilization, these games were showing what PCs could really do.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
They offered more complex gameplay, better graphics, and way more customization than you could ever get on a console.
Right.
And then with the rise of the internet,
Yeah.
PC gaming really started to take off.
I can see why.
Yeah, because suddenly, you could connect with other players all over the world.
Yeah.
It opened up a whole new level of possibilities.
Yeah, for sure.
I mean, it's really amazing to think about, right, how the 80s were like the starting point.
Yeah.
For so much of what we see in gaming today.
Yeah.
Like the rise of home consoles.
Yeah.
The birth of all these iconic franchises.
Yeah.
The emergence of PC gaming, the way games were starting to blend with other forms of media.
Yeah.
It was a decade of just incredible transformation.
It was a decade where so many seeds were planted.
It really was.
Yeah, that are still growing today.
Right.
Looking back, it's clear, I think, that the 80s were way more than just neon and big hair.
Yeah.
It was a decade that laid the foundation for so much of the world we live in today.
Absolutely. I mean, everything from the technology we use to the ways we entertain ourselves.
And I love how this deep dive really showed how video games played a big part in all that.
Oh, yeah. I mean, the story of video games in the 80s is really a story of innovation and competition and the power of human creativity.
It's a story that's still being written today.
It really is. I mean, it makes you wonder what the next chapter holds.
I know. It's exciting to think about.
It really is.
Well, hey, that is a fantastic note to wrap things up on.
I think so.
Thank you so much for joining me on this epic journey.
My pleasure. Anytime.
Back to the 1980s. And for all of you listening out there, keep playing with power.